Dearest friends, this is the last of our evenings together. And I thought perhaps we could begin this last session with some extracts from Major Tudor Pole's diary. It was written in November 1918, after the end of the war. Major Tudor Pole had been in Haifa, and he had come across to Akka. And he said, "How often have I pictured myself in these surroundings? I have longed to be here ever since those distant days in 1908, when I first heard of the Baha'is when I was in Constantinople. I arrived at Haifa at 8 p.m. Immediately on arrival, I sent a messenger to Abdu'l Bahá's house further up the mountain, asking to be allowed to present myself. Two of the younger Persian believers came down at once to see me. One was Mirza Ahmad Sorab, and they told me the master was at Akka and was not expected back for several days. Next morning, I hired a 2-horse carriage and, leaving my servant and the luggage at the hotel, set off for Akka. The journey has been described too often to bear repetition. It is perfectly fascinating. There is no road between Haifa and Akka, and the light railway has been torn up. So one drives for 2.5 hours around the bay, on the hard sand close to the blue, blue sea. Half the time, the carriage is in the sea, because the harder sand is where the waves lap over it. From a distance, the ancient walled city of the Crusades looks most picturesque, standing right up out of the water, and reminds one a little of a miniature Istanbul. But Akka from the inside is an awful place, full of smells and slums and dirt. Its one feature of beauty is the sweet and abundant water supply, brought into the city from the distant hills along a Roman aqueduct. At last we reached the master's house, close to the sea wall, but shut in on all sides by slums and courts. A long stone stairway leads up to the living room in this prison house, where Baha'u'llah spent the last years of his life and where his son has lived on and off for 40 years. The master was standing at the top, waiting to greet me with that sweet smile and cheery welcome for which he is famous. For 74 long years, Abdu'l Bahá has lived in the midst of tragedy and hardship. Yet nothing has robbed or can rob him of his cheery optimism, spiritual insight, and keen sense of humor. He was looking a little older than when I saw him 7 years ago, and certainly more vigorous than when he was in England after the exhausting American trip. His voice was as strong as ever, his step virile, his hair and beard, if possible, more silver white than ever. He is delighted to welcome the change of regime, but I could detect a tragic note. For if the British occupation had taken place 10 years ago, he would have been able to travel throughout the Near and Middle East, spreading the glad tidings of his father's mission. He still, however, spends a few weeks now and again in Akka prison house that has now become his property. I think this was the house of Aboud, to which Major Tudor Pole was referring. After lunch, Abdu'l Bahá drove me out to the garden tomb of Baha'u'llah, about 2 miles from the city. He approached the tomb in complete silence, praying with bent head, a wonderfully venerable figure in his white turban and flowing grey robe. On reaching the portal to the tomb itself, the master prostrated himself at length and kissed the steps leading to the inner chamber. There was a majestic humility about that action that baffles description. Then we took tea in the garden, and Abdu'l Bahá told me many stories about Baha'u'llah, his superhuman endurance, and his wonderful teaching. When we returned to Akka, the Persian colony, consisting of perhaps 35 persons, had assembled, and we sat around the room drinking tea whilst Abdu'l Bahá described his visit to Clifton. That was where Major Chudapur lived, in Bristol, and the people he met there. Then I went to pay my respects to the military governor, curious to discover what he knew of and felt about the greatest religious personage in Asia today. The governor was full of a demonstration he was arranging for the morrow in celebration of world peace. A band was coming, the notables of Akka were to parade around the town, the governor would answer cheers and make a little speech from the balcony of the town hall. A notable occasion for Akka, freed after all these hundreds of years from the cruel Turkish yoke. I inquired whether Abdu'l Bahá had been invited to the function. "Do you mean Abbas Effendi?" No, I don't think we've asked him. Perhaps he should have had an invitation." He who has worked night and day for over 50 years to propagate the ideals of world peace and brotherhood, whose devoted followers number millions, whose cause is doing so much to lessen religious discord in the East, he had not even received an invitation to take part in the peace celebrations of his native town, because, as it turned out, his name did not appear on the list of the local notables prepared by the municipal authorities for the guidance of the governor. A prophet in his own country with a vengeance. I expressed surprise. The shock had driven indignation from me, and an invitation was duly dispatched. Then I returned to the prison house and spent the evening with the master, supping with him and answering his questions about the new administration. Then I slept in the room next Abdu'l Bahá's, which was Baha'u'llah's before him. Simple attics with stone floors and practically no furniture. Abdu'l Bahá still gives away all the money and lives the life of poverty himself. Before breakfast, the house was filled with believers who had come to receive the morning blessing. I had brought Abdu'l Bahá letters from all parts of the world, and he spent the morning dictating replies for me to take away. I gave him the Persian camel hair cloak, and it greatly pleased him, for the winter is here, and he had given away the only cloak he possessed. I made him promise to keep this one through the winter anyway, and I trust he does. At lunch we had another long talk. Then came the leave-taking and the master's blessing. He sent his greetings by me to all his friends in Egypt, Europe, England, and America. As I drove off on my return to Haifa, I caught a glimpse of the master, staff in hand, wending his way through the awful Akka slums, on his way to attend the local peace celebrations. He stands out as a majestic figure. And here I am again on Mount Carmel, writing this letter with the moonlit sea before me. I have paid my visit to the governor of Haifa, and tomorrow am free to climb Mount Carmel to visit the tomb of the Bab and to spend one night in the house of the Master among his devoted friends. He himself will not return here for another week. He is helping to solve religious problems that have arisen in the Akka area as a result of the British occupation. Abdu'l Bahá looks to America as the nation which, being more disinterested than any European power, will be able to help forward the realization of world unity and peace. He anticipates that a spiritual revival, not merely one of religion, but possibly one outside organized religion altogether. There is a footnote concerning Major Tudor Pole, because he always kept in touch with the National Spiritual Assembly in London, and dear Elizabeth Greaves became a friend of his. And when Tudor Pole died, it was found that he had left to the National Spiritual Assembly the rosary beads that Abdu'l Bahá had used and had given to Tudor Pole, and also the signet ring, which Abdu'l Bahá had taken off his own finger and given to Tudor Pole. And in 1970, when the new National Assembly of the Guianas, over there in South America, to which the British community had devoted so much of its effort in those years, dear Vida Backwell, who lives here in Northern Ireland, was in Guyana for a long time, and her youngest boy was born there. But the National Assembly sent to that first convention of the Guianas as a precious gift for the National Archives the signet ring that Abdu'l Bahá had given to Tudor Pole. So you see how these golden threads unite all Baha'is across the world. Now Abdu'l Bahá's residence was in Haifa, in the same house that we are graciously permitted to visit as part of the pilgrimage. And that's where he received Lord Lamington on July 15th, 1919. Lord Lamington was directing Syrian relief work from headquarters in Damascus, and he called on Abdu'l Bahá to receive, in his own words, the blessings of the Master. When Abdu'l Bahá indicated his intention of returning the visit, Lord Lamington said, "No, my duty and my privilege is to call on you personally, and I do not wish you to take the trouble to come over to see me." It was when Lord Lamington came again 2 days later to say goodbye because he was returning to Britain that Abdu'l Bahá gave to him his own signet ring. Abdu'l Bahá wore a number of these rings from time to time, and he gave them away and had to have another one because he was always giving away the one he got. He gave one to Lord Lamington, and that ring is now in the National Archives at the Hazrat al-Quds in London. It was bequeathed to the Baha'is by Lord Lamington in his will. Asked at that time about his future plans, Abdu'l Bahá said that, if circumstances permitted, he would go to visit Ashgabat, then Japan, and India. We know that, in fact, circumstances did not permit. But it's interesting to know what the Master was thinking at that time, because he was then 75 years old. But we should go back a few years, because in the morning of the 14th February 1914, Abdu'l Bahá went to the pilgrim house near to the shrine of the Bab, where some of the American pilgrims were staying. And the Master sat in the room facing the tomb of Baha'u'llah. He said, "The view from this hospice is very beautiful, especially because it faces the tomb of the Blessed Beauty in Akka. In the future, it will all be built up between Akka and Haifa. Akka and Haifa will be joined together, and will take first place in the world. Now, as I glance into the future, I see the greatest port in the world here. This semicircular bay will be a large harbor for ships, so that the entering boats may be protected from the waves and winds of the storm. This harbor will be filled with the ships of the nations. All of these regions will be decorated by buildings and lofty palaces. Many gardens and flower beds will be made. There will be electric lights, and from here to Acre will be flooded with them. It will be a wonderful sight, especially at night, for those who come from the sea or who look from the summit of the mountains. From all these regions, the cry, Ya Abdu'l Bahá, shall arise. All the souls will come in a state of supplication, imploring and chanting the communes. In every town, the melodies from the Mashriq al-Ashqa on this Mount Carmel will be most pleasing to the ears. As a sort of footnote, when Abdu'l Bahá was in America, Safa Kinney, one of the Kinney children, is said to have asked Abdu'l Bahá, Abdu'l Bahá, do you know everything? No, I do not know everything, was the reply. But when I need to know something, it is pictured before me. Then there are some lovely stories from Curtis Kelsey, the young American who went to Haifa in 1921. But first, we must start with an experience of Mr. Roy Wilhelm, a Baha'i in Manhattan, because one day he read the words of the Bab written in the prison fortress of Marku. How veiled are ye, O my creatures, who, without any right, have consigned him, the Bab, unto a mountain, Marku, not one of whose inhabitants is worthy of mention. With him, which is with me, there is no one except him who is one of the letters of the living of my book. In his presence, which is my presence, there is not at night even a lighted lamp. And yet, in places of worship, which in varying degrees reach out to him, unnumbered lamps are shining. All that is on earth have been created for him, and all partake with delight of his benefits. And yet they are so veiled from him as to refuse him even a lamp. Roy Wilhelm was so moved by this that he wrote immediately to Abdu'l Bahá asking permission to send a lighting plant to Haifa to light the shrine of the Bab. And very shortly he received a cable from the master stating that 3 plants were needed. Roy instantly responded. In a matter of weeks, the machinery was on its way to Mount Carmel, where it remained for about a year. Some of the friends in the United States were aware of the project, and they tried to speed things up. A Californian believer sent a young electrical engineer over to do the work. But the master, saying thank you, sent him back, saying it wasn't yet the time. And a Persian, Husseini Karubei, does that mean Hussein the electrician? Anyway, he also traveled to Haifa to ask Abdu'l Bahá if he could work on the project. The master said that when the time was right, he would be called to assist. And he was. Eventually, young Curtis Kelsey, whose name had been suggested to Abdu'l Bahá by Roy Wilhelm, arrived in Haifa with the task of installing the electric lighting. And Curtis described Haifa in September 1921. It was nothing like Abdu'l Bahá had said it would be like in the future, a metropolis extending around the bay. It was a village, which probably looked like a village from the days of Jesus. There were Arab women carrying jars of water on their heads, merchants selling their wares in the open, Arab men gathered in the shade smoking bubble pipes, a couple of camels tied to a post and unbothered by the scorching sun. Mount Carmel was a huge limestone rock covered with scrubby vegetation, with a few houses at its base, and the shrine of the Bab was a light-colored stone structure with a flat roof as bare as a fortress. Near the top of the mountain was the Carmelite monastery, which had been established centuries ago by the Roman Catholic Church to watch for Christ's return. He was supposed to return in a cloud. Being in Haifa was like stepping back in time. Certainly a different world from the Woolworth buildings in New York and its sleek elevators. Waiting at the railway station for Curtis were Fujita and Dr. Lotfullah Hakim, two young men who served the master, and they were sitting in a high buckboard wagon that Abdu'l Bahá would ride when he was not walking or riding a donkey. Both young men spoke English, one with a heavy Japanese accent and the other with a Persian accent. But those three young men, Curtis and Fujita and Lotfullah Hakim, were to share a room while in the Holy Land and to grow very close together. They drove in the buckboard wagon to the pilgrim house, where the master awaited them. They were greeted by two ladies, one from the east and one from the west, and were ushered to a large table in the front room, and on it was luncheon. A large platter of Persian pilau, lamb, chopped nuts, and candied orange peel. Saffron was sprinkled on it. You can imagine Curtis Kelce's astonishment at all this that was laid before him. He says small glasses of tea and bowls of yogurt were next to each plate. Unleavened bread was piled high on a dish. Everyone was standing and chatting, mainly about Curtis's trip from New York City, when suddenly a door opened and Abdu'l Bahá appeared, heading for Curtis. Abdu'l Bahá was dressed in a cream-colored abba and white turban, and his eyes were smiling. The master shook Curtis's hand and said, "Marhaba, marhaba. You are welcome, you are welcome." After washing his hands in a bowl of water that Fujita had brought over, he had everyone sit around the table, and Abdu'l Bahá had Curtis sit next to him, and asked how the friends were faring in New York, and how Curtis liked Haifa. And so Curtis Kelce's stay in the Holy Land began. It would end after Abdu'l Bahá's passing in less than 3 months' time. Shortly after Curtis settled into the small room he used to share with Fujita and Dr. Hakim, a young woman came by with a branch bearing about 10 oranges. It was something the master had asked her to go and take to Curtis. It was still time before the young American was started on the lighting project, and so he busied himself with any repair and maintenance jobs he found around, and there were plenty of those. In the garage, when he found the garage, there were 2 cars, gifts of some American friends. One was a big Cunningham, and the other was a Ford, and neither of them now worked. In a few days, Curtis had the vehicles operating, and he took the master for several rides around Mount Carmel. There was no automobile traffic to speak of in Haifa in 1921. There was only one other person, a young Arab, who had a motor car. But later, Curtis received permission from Abdu'l Bahá to use the Ford when he went over to Baji to do the lighting work over there. That put 3 cars on the roads of Haifa. Came the day when Curtis was asked to be ready by late afternoon to leave for Baji. It would all begin. So he rested well during the afternoon siesta. He wasn't used to this afternoon siesta business, but he soon found it very necessary because it was so hot. He was ready when the master was ready, and here is what happened. Before leaving, Curtis, Ruhi Afnan, one of the master's grandsons, and a servant by the name of Khosrow gathered the food and tools and put them into the high buckboard wagon. With the master aboard, they headed for the railway station, a sleepy little place where local Arabs like to congregate with their camels. The train, filled with chattering people and their chickens and goats, was waiting for Abdu'l Bahá and his party. But the master sat down on a bench inside the station house. Outside, the conductor paced the platform. If the train arrived after sunset, the passengers would be unable to enter Akka, for the city closed its gates at nightfall. The conductor knew he couldn't leave without Sir Abdu'l Bahá Abbas, who had come to the Holy Land as a prisoner and now was the revered father of the poor. It all seemed strange to Curtis, but he never questioned the wisdom of the situation. And in about 5 minutes, an Arab, leading his camel, approached, tied the camel to a post, and entered the station house and headed for Abdu'l Bahá. After a brief conversation, the Arab went his way, and the master boarded the train, which had windowless openings. Many passengers hummed precariously out of those openings, not because there wasn't enough room inside. They seemed to enjoy challenging the elements, much like those Americans who like riding the roller coaster. In the morning, the same train would be waiting to take the same people back to Haifa. When the train pulled into Haifa, the sun seemed to be setting on the sea. It was cooler than when they had left Haifa, but not uncomfortable. Baji was 2.5 miles from where they were. Khosrow immediately left to prepare supper. All the passengers rushed to Akka's gate, but Abdu'l Bahá walked to the station house and sat down on a bench. Curtis and Ruhi stood by patiently, with Curtis wondering what strange occurrence would unfold next. Only the howl of jackals could be heard as night draped over Akka. In a few minutes, Khalid, a servant who lived in Baji, appeared with the master's white donkey. Still the master remained seated. A full moon graced the night sky, and the stars sparkled with the way they did over the Utah desert. It was so clear that Curtis could see in the distance an Arab, mounted on a white stallion, riding hard toward the station house. It was the person the master was waiting for. They spoke for several minutes, laughing at times. Soon Abdu'l Bahá emerged and mounted the donkey. The Arab headed back in the direction from which he had come and was quickly enveloped by the night. Walking to Baji that evening was one of the most memorable experiences in Curtis's life. Obviously, he was on earth, but in a sense, he wasn't, for he seemed detached from the tensions and woes of the world. He never felt freer. His heart was filled with the vibrating love of Abdu'l Bahá. It was a love that seemed to cleanse his inner being and move his spirit toward the wispy clouds that floated overhead. It didn't matter that nothing was said, for words were unnecessary. Who needed to say anything when you were immersed in peace and contentment? What wonderful things would happen next, Curtis thought. After a while, the master pulled his abba over his shoulders and spoke in English. Beautiful night, beautiful moon, beautiful clouds. No one else commented. A moment or two later, Abdu'l Bahá turned to Curtis, who was on his right, and said, "Are you finding it difficult to walk?" What could he say, Curtis thought, for in a sense he wasn't walking. Rather, he was in the embrace of the master. "I'm very happy to be walking with you," he told Abdu'l Bahá. If he had been more eloquent, he would have said what he really felt. But the master knew why Curtis felt the way he did, for he said, "You feel this way because you are filled with love." And at that point, Curtis felt he could have floated. When they reached Baji, they didn't go into the mansion because at that time it was held by the covenant breakers. Instead, they were to spend the night in a small building near the shrine of Baha'u'llah. Its 4 rooms surrounded an open inner garden with an orange tree. Many of us know that house and the open inner garden. In the dining room, Khosrow had spread out the dinner. A platter of small squash stuffed with rice, meat, and candied orange peel. I would think that Curtis loved the candied orange peel because every time it arrives, he mentions it. There was a bowl of yogurt at each place, as well as a glass of tea, also a pitcher of sour milk, and a large bowl with oranges, pomegranates, and bunches of Damascus grapes. The conversation was engaging, but not profound. In fact, most of the talk was about food, with Abdu'l Bahá pointing out how tender the grapes were and how special the tea was. Curtis felt that around Abdu'l Bahá, people did useful things. Being enveloped in a mystical trance was not conducive to furthering an ever-advancing civilization. Abdu'l Bahá, Curtis knew, was the epitome of moderation. Even divine reading had its limits. A flight into spiritual realms shouldn't propel you away from the cares of the world, but inspire you to be of service to others. Having been near the master for nearly a month, Curtis discovered that he had a way of transporting you into those mystical realms and then gently leading you back to the world, which Abdu'l Bahá considered a workshop where, through serving others, you sharpen and strengthen your character and draw closer to God. In fact, Abdu'l Bahá once said, "The world is a workshop, not an art gallery." About halfway through the meal, someone knocked on the outside door. "Come in the name of God," Abdu'l Bahá called out in Arabic. When Khosrow finally removed the crossbar and opened the door, there stood a tall Arab, about 6'3", with a black moustache and a goatee beard. He didn't budge until the master said again, "Come in the name of God." And a chair was placed to the right of Abdu'l Bahá, where the man was asked to sit. They engaged in animated discussion, all in Arabic. At that point, the master pushed his turban back on his head, and he and the man started laughing. Soon, Ruhi began to laugh. It was contagious because Curtis was swept into the hilarity, even though he didn't understand a word of what was uttered. After the man left, Ruhi explained what had been discussed and what Abdu'l Bahá had learned from the discussion. It seemed that the master had asked the Arab if he belonged to a tribe where the husband had to steal something during the day in order for his wife to allow him to enter their tent that night. When the man acknowledged that he belonged to such a tribe, the master inquired if he had ever been denied entrance to the tent. Never, the man declared. And at that point, Abdu'l Bahá knew that the man sitting next to him was the culprit who was stealing the sweet oranges in his garden at Baji. So the master asked the man if he had ever tried eating sour oranges. When the Arab grimaced, Abdu'l Bahá assured him that they tasted delicious with sugar. The next day, Abdu'l Bahá discovered that many of the sour oranges had been stripped from his trees. The day they were to leave Baji, Curtis was up at 5. Before breakfast, he pumped enough water to shower the garden, then walked towards the house. The sun was barely up. Sitting on the porch was the master, facing the sea. A plate full of jasmine blossoms was on a chair in front of him. As Curtis approached the porch, he could smell the blossoms. It was like being in the shrines, where the floral fragrance was always present and there was peace. Abdu'l Bahá motioned to Curtis to sit beside him and then poured him a cup of tea. "Did you sleep well?" Curtis asked. The master smiled and said in English, "Last night I slept very well." Continuing to smile and looking at Curtis with a twinkle in his eye, he paused. And then he asked, "Is my English good?" "Yes," Curtis responded, "and I must learn Persian." "That would be very good." After that, nothing more was said. Abdu'l Bahá and his American electrician watched the dawn chased away by the brilliance of golden daylight. Curtis went with Ruhi and Abdu'l Bahá to the shrine of Baha'u'llah. Before entering, they removed their shoes. There was Curtis, tall, slender, open-faced, standing beside Ruhi and about 3 feet behind the master, at the threshold of the sepulchre that contained the bodily remains of the Blessed Beauty. Again, this simple young man from the West had been lifted into a heavenly state. Nothing but the pleading voice of Abdu'l Bahá could be heard. Every other sound and thought vanished. Though he couldn't understand a word, Curtis was moved by the emotion of Abdu'l Bahá chanting the tablet of visitation. There was no semblance of self from the figure before Curtis, just a total expression of devotion, a surrendering of the will, an outpouring of love so intense that it seemed the master was offering his heart to Baha'u'llah. After prostrating before the threshold for several minutes, Abdu'l Bahá stood and asked Curtis and Ruhi to collect the rugs and ornaments in the shrine, because they were to be taken to the house of Abud in Akka that afternoon. When that was done, The master asked Curtis to come with him. Curtis didn't wonder where they were going or what was going to happen. That no longer mattered. What was real was the master's request. They walked in silence toward the mansion. Halfway there, Abdu'l Bahá stopped and asked Curtis how he planned to arrange the lighting of the shrine of Baji. A surge of confidence swept over Curtis, and without hesitating, he explained that he would place underground lighting in the inner garden of the shrine so that light would shine up through the flowers. Then he would electrify the oil lamps, thus preserving their 19th century character. And finally, he would place lights around the cornice of the shrine. The master nodded positively and explained, Bali, Bali. As they walked closer to the mansion, Curtis noticed an elderly man approach the master. Introducing the believer to Curtis, Abdu'l Bahá pointed out that the man, who was a mason, would help build the stone enclosure that was to house the lighting plant. The fact that the man didn't speak English and Curtis didn't know Persian or Arabic was never mentioned. It was understood that all would work out well. In Abdu'l Bahá's mind, Curtis felt, the electrification project was done. It was only a matter of time before the world would appreciate the effort. The only thing that was necessary was the implementation of the plan. It was a dream of the master to have the shrine of the Bab bathed in light and at the same time to look across the Bay of Haifa and see the shrine of Baha'u'llah illumined. So that this would happen, he told Curtis, you are to spend 2 weeks working in Baji, then return to Haifa to work on the shrine of the Bab for 2 weeks, and you are to follow this pattern until you have completed your work. After making sure that Curtis understood all that, Abdu'l Bahá introduced him to the young Persian who had come from India, as promised, Hussein the electrician. Abdu'l Bahá said that Hussein was going to help Curtis and assured him that they would learn to work well together even though they couldn't understand each other's language. The lighting project was underway. The days and weeks passed by in the Holy Land. Then, at dawn one day, elderly Abul Hassan, who belonged to the family of the Bab, committed suicide. He was an able workman at the World Centre, and Abdu'l Bahá loved him dearly. His suicide was a carefully calculated act. He settled all his personal affairs, then he strode down to the sea, folded his clothes neatly, and left them on the bench, the beach, and walked into the sea. His death grieved Abdu'l Bahá. On the day of the funeral, the master helped to carry Abul Hassan's coffin to the gravesite. That night, at his home in Haifa, Abdu'l Bahá spoke to the friends about suicide. He said, no one should injure himself on purpose or take his own life. God never places a burden on us greater than we can carry. Each burden we endure is for our own good and development. Should anyone at any time encounter hard and perplexing times, he must say to himself, this too will pass. Then he will grow calm. When experiencing difficulties, he added, I would say to myself, this too will pass. And I would become calm again. Now, if someone cannot be patient and endure, then it is better for him to arise in the service of the cause of God. It would be better for him to pursue the path of martyrdom than to commit suicide. A few days after making these statements, Abdu'l Bahá passed away, ending a lifetime of martyrdom. The friends realized then that Mirza Abul Hassan had sensed that the one he loved more than anyone else would soon be gone, and that he couldn't bear to live without him. In a compilation by Lady Blomfield and Shoghi Effendi, which was repaired sometime after the ascension of Abdu'l Bahá, they described the last weeks of the Master's life. From that compilation, we will follow the last 3 days. On the last Friday morning of his stay on earth, November 25th, the Master said to his daughters, "The wedding of Khosrow must take place today. If you are too much occupied, I myself will make the necessary preparations, for it must take place this day." Khosrow was one of the favored and trusted servants of the Master's household. Abdu'l Bahá attended the noonday prayer at the mosque. When he came out, he found the poor waiting for the alms, which it was his custom to give every Friday. This day, as usual, he stood, in spite of very great fatigue, whilst he gave a coin to everyone with his own hands. After lunch, he dictated some tablets, his last ones, to Ruhi Effendi. When he had rested, he walked in the garden. He seemed to be in a deep reverie. His good and faithful servant, Ismail Aga, relates the following. Sometime, about 20 days before my master passed away, I was near the garden when I heard him summon an old believer, saying, "Come with me, that we may admire together the beauty of the garden. Behold what the spirit of devotion is able to achieve. This flourishing place was, a few years ago, but a heap of stones, and now it is verdant with foliage and flowers. My desire is that, after I am gone, the loved ones may all arise to serve the divine cause, and, please God, so it shall be. Ere long men will arise who shall bring life to the world." A few days after this, he said, "I am so fatigued. The hour has come when I must leave everything and take my flight. I am too weary to walk." Then he said, "It was during the closing days of the Blessed Beauty, when I was engaged in gathering together his papers, which were strewn over the sofa in his writing chamber at Baji, that he turned to me and said, 'It is no use to gather them. I must leave them and flee.' I also have finished my work. I can do nothing more. Therefore, I must leave it and take my departure." 3 days before his ascension, while seated in the garden, he called me and said, "I am sick with fatigue. Bring 2 of your oranges for me, that I may eat them for your sake." This I did, and having eaten them, he turned to me, saying, "Have you any of your sweet lemons?" He bade me fetch a few. Whilst I was plucking them, he came over to the tree, saying, "Nay, but I must gather them with my own hands." Having eaten of the fruit, he turned to me and asked, "Do you desire anything more?" Then, with a pathetic gesture of his hands, he touchingly, emphatically, and deliberately said, "Now it is finished. It is finished." These significant words penetrated my very soul. I felt each time he uttered them as if a knife were struck into my heart. I understood his meaning, but never dreamed his end was so nigh. Later in the evening of Friday, Abdu'l Bahá blessed the bride and bridegroom who had just been married. He spoke impressively to them. "Khosrow," he said, "you have spent your childhood and youth in the service of this house. It is my hope that you will grow old under the same roof, ever and always serving God." During the evening he attended the usual meeting of the friends in his own audience chamber. In the morning of Saturday, November 26th, he arose early, came to the tea room and had some tea. He asked for the fur-lined coat which belonged to Baha'u'llah. He often put on this coat when he was cold or did not feel well. He so loved it. He then withdrew to his room, lay down on his bed and said, "Cover me up. I am very cold. Last night I did not sleep well. I felt cold. This is serious. It is the beginning." After more blankets had been put on, he asked for the fur coat he had taken off to be placed over him. That day he was rather feverish. In the evening his temperature rose still higher, but during the night the fever left him. After midnight he asked for some tea. On Sunday morning, November 27th, he said, "I am quite well, and will get up as usual and have tea with you in the tea room." After he had dressed, he was persuaded to remain on the sofa in his room. In the afternoon, he sent all the friends up to the tomb of the Bab, where on the occasion of the anniversary of the declaration of the covenant, a feast was being held, offered by a Parsi pilgrim who had lately arrived from India. At 4 in the afternoon, being on the sofa in his room, he said, "Ask my sister and all the family to come and have tea with me." After tea, the Mufti of Haifa and the head of the municipality, another visitor, were received by him. They remained about an hour. He spoke to them about Baha'u'llah, related to them his second dream, showed them extraordinary kindness and even more than his usual courtesy. He then bade them farewell, walking with them to the outer door, in spite of their pleading that he should remain resting on the sofa. He then received a visit from the head of the police, an Englishman, who too had his share of the master's gracious kindness. To him he gave some silk, hand-woven Persian handkerchiefs, which he very greatly appreciated. His 4 sons-in-law and Ruhi Effendi came to him after returning from the gathering on the mountain. They said to him, "The giver of the feast was unhappy because you were not there." He said to them, "But I was there. Though my body was absent, my spirit was there in your midst. I was present with the friends in the tomb. The friends must not attach any importance to the absence of my body. In spirit I am and shall always be with the friends, even though I am far away." The same evening he asked after the health of every member of the household, of the pilgrims and of the friends in Haifa. Very good, he said, when told that none were ill. This was his very last utterance concerning the friends. At 8 in the evening he retired to bed, after taking a little nourishment, saying, "I am quite well." He told all the family to go to bed and rest. 2 of his daughters, however, stayed with him. That night the master had gone to sleep very calmly, quite free from fever. He woke about 1:15 a.m., got up, and walked across to a table where he drank some water. He took off an outer night garment, saying, "I am too warm." He went back to bed, and when his daughter Ruha Khanum came later on and approached, she found him lying peacefully. And as he looked into her face, he asked her to lift up the net curtains, saying, "I have difficulty in breathing. Give me more air." Some rose water was brought, of which he drank, sitting up in bed to do so, without any help. He again lay down, and as some food was offered him, he remarked in a clear, distinct voice, "You wish me to take some food, and I am going?" He gave them a beautiful look. His face was so calm, his expression so serene. They thought him asleep. We will look for the rest of that night and the next 2 days to see them through the eyes of the young American. "Get up! Get up! The master! The master!" someone cried, while pounding on the door of Curtis's room. Alarmed, the 3 young men inside awoke, jumped out of bed, and groped in the dark for their clothes. It was about 1 a.m., November 28th, and cool. But the weather didn't bother them as they dashed to Abdu'l Bahá's house. Curtis was still tucking his shirt into his trousers. As Curtis entered the house, people were weeping, some hysterically. He had practically to push his way through the crowd of people, mostly Persians, groaning and moaning, some wailing uncontrollably. When he reached the master's room, Dr. Florian Krug was staying beside the bed where Abdu'l Bahá lay. The physician, who had arrived in Haifa with his wife 2 weeks earlier, turned to Curtis and said, "The master has just descended." Dr. Krug, a prominent New York doctor who bitterly opposed the faith when his wife embraced it, and then became a Baha'i when he met Abdu'l Bahá in America, closed the lids of the master's eyes. Curtis had never witnessed such deeply felt despair. For some reason, he couldn't show any emotion. That wasn't like him, for he wasn't hard-hearted. Perhaps he wasn't faithful, he thought, and forced himself to cry. But he stopped, and an inner voice commanded, "No, not that. Now is the time to observe." There was pandemonium in the main central room. Of course, Curtis knew. Some people were crying out as if asking God, "Why does this have to happen? What will become of the cause now that the master is gone?" The one who could answer those questions was across the room, the greatest holy leaf. She calmly went about, comforting the grief-stricken, absorbing their pain. As Curtis watched her move from person to person, stroking a shoulder, clasping a stretched-out hand, he noticed that she exhibited the kind of strength that Abdu'l Bahá had radiated. Some sensed that and clung to her. Her control, her poise, her unconstrained flow of compassion assured him that the faith would not falter. She was, at that moment, the head of the faith that her brother had led so successfully for 29 years, giving his all. She was the tower of strength that all would rally around for support. As he watched the greatest holy leaf, her eyes caught his, and she walked over to him. Since he was not crying, he wondered why she was coming toward him. "Kelsey," she said, "will you take Fujita and Khosrow to Akka to tell the friends there of the Master's passing, and then come right back?" It was about 2:30 in the morning when they piled into the Master's Ford with Curtis in the driver's seat, Fujita beside him, and Khosrow in the back. There was no longer any chill in the air. In fact, it was a balmy night, the same kind of night as when Curtis had walked with the Master to Baji. The only sounds were the rhythmic beat of the surf washing over the beach and pulling back to the sea, and the near quiet crying of Fujita and Khosrow. Tears welled up in Curtis's eyes as he thought of Abdu'l Bahá and his experience with him during the past 2 months, and he began to cry openly when he thought of what a shock the Master's passing would be to the friends across the world. It was more than losing a close friend or a member of your family. So many would feel that their link with God had been severed. Though Curtis was weeping, he kept driving. He couldn't stop, for the greatest holy leaf wanted the believers in Akka to know about the passing of the Master. Curtis began to pray for strength. Soon all three stopped crying, because they were approaching a stream that they had to cross in order to reach their destination. The car stopped, and Khosrow waded into the water, searching for a sandbar. Without one, it would be impossible to drive across the stream, which fed into the Bay of Haifa. In a matter of minutes, Khosrow found what he was looking for, and Curtis followed him, making it safely to the shore. They encountered another stream and conquered it in the same way. Sharing the sad news with the friends, especially after waking them, was difficult. All of them expressed disbelief. Some stared at the three young men as if what they had heard was part of a dream. Curtis's immediate instinct was to stay with the friends to try to comfort them, but they had to be back as soon as possible. After urging the Akka friends to come to Haifa to attend the funeral, Curtis, Fujita, and Khosrow rushed back to Haifa to see what they could do next for the greatest holy leaf. And then he describes the Master's funeral. Even in death, the Master was the cause of unity, advancing the principle of the oneness of humankind. People from all quarters of Haifa, poor and rich, marched side by side to Abdu'l Bahá's house, where the casket rested. Others had come long distances to attend the Master's funeral. The High Commissioner of Palestine, Sir Herbert Samuel, the Governor of Venetia, the Governor of Jerusalem, Druze leaders from the Lebanon mountains, Turks, Kurds, Arabs, Greeks, Egyptians, Germans, Swiss, Americans, Persians, and British were a part of the spontaneous outpouring of respect for Abdu'l Bahá that turned into a procession of 10,000. It was as if the Master was standing on the mountain top, arms outstretched, drawing the multitudes together as one family. Even the religious leaders, Anglican, Roman Catholic, and Greek Orthodox priests, along with the chiefs of the Muslim community and the Jewish leaders, marched together, united in their love and admiration for one they knew was brought to Palestine as a despised prisoner, and who rose out of the bondage of injustice through his deep love and unqualified service to all. They knew how often his life had been threatened, how small-minded men plotted to seize the Baha'i properties, which he guarded like a lion. And in the crowd were those who at one time were infected by the poisonous rumors circulated by the enemies of the faith and the covenant breakers, but who grew to love the Master after meeting him. Everyone knew that Abdu'l Bahá had helped to keep the people of Haifa and Akka from starving during World War I. Abdu'l Bahá had often spent hours on his feet giving sacks of wheat, which he himself had grown, to the poor of Haifa and Akka. There was no way they could repay him for what he had done for them. No wonder merchants closed their shops, teachers shut down their school, and government officials left their desks to be at Abdu'l Bahá's funeral. No one could remember the likes of the human outpouring of appreciation and love that was afforded Abdu'l Bahá. It was unprecedented. The people marched slowly up Mount Carmel, passing the coffin containing the remains of the Master, from outstretched hands to outstretched hands. People vied with each other for the privilege of carrying the casket for only a moment. And they weren't Baha'is. For 2 hours they marched, as many wailed, "O God, my God, our Father has left us. Our Father has left us." Halfway to the shrine, a troop of Boy Scouts placed a wreath on the coffin. When the procession finally reached the garden at the shrine of the Bab, the casket, draped with a simple paisley shawl, was tenderly placed upon a plain table covered with a white linen cloth. People pressed closer to the coffin, a last expression of love for their dear departed friend. There were 9 speakers, leaders of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim communities. With fervor and passion, they hailed him as the true friend of the poor and downtrodden, praised him for his work in developing understanding between different religions and different races, and called him the leader of mankind. The crowd heard a saint being described, and they knew it was an accurate description, for many had been the recipients of his love and care. The casket was lifted carefully from the table and placed on the broad shoulders of the shrine's caretaker, who stepped slowly into the vault in the room next to the one sheltering the remains of the Bab. Only one man could take the casket down, for there was no room for anyone else. After the funeral, this same caretaker, a powerful man, realized why the Master had asked a puzzling question the day before he passed away. "You are a strong man," he said. "Could you not carry me away to a place where I could rest? I am tired of this world." And so another document was added to the precious documents of the covenant, the will and testament of Abdu'l Bahá, which the beloved guardian called the Charter for the Building of the World Order. In it, Abdu'l Bahá appointed by name his eldest grandson, Shoghi Effendi, as guardian of the cause of God. There are just two more things. When Mirza Ali Akbar was leaving for Constantinople, Abdu'l Bahá counseled him, and these are the Master's words. Wherever thou goest, announce the wonderful Baha'i greeting to the teachers of the course, and tell them on my behalf the responsibility of the steady progress of the course depends on you. You are the physicians of the sick body of the world of humanity. Why are ye silent? Shout! Why are ye sitting? Move! Why are ye quiet? Stir! This is not the day of rest and comfort. Let the world profit by your teaching and learn from your example. The progress of the cause depends on the energy and wisdom of the teachers. And to some young Baha'is who came to see him, Abdu'l Bahá said, my work is done. The tree of my life has yielded its fruits. I have set a fire in the world. Your duty is to add to its flame. My sons, now it is your turn. I would like to remain silent for some time and listen to the incoming news of those who are endeavoring to spread the fragrances of God. How far shall they succeed? How will they promote the word of God? How will they raise the melodies and sing the songs of Ya Abdu'l Bahá? Assuredly, the blessed perfection is with such souls. They shall see with their own eyes the confirmations of Baha'u'llah, just as I saw them when addressing large gatherings in churches and temples. I saw them hovering like the birds of paradise.